Welcome everyone. What a pleasure it has been to get to know the veterans of all the aspects of the research that I've done. Nothing has given me a greater thrill than the opportunity to meet these wonderful men. This treasure trove of history, we must guard it, and all the values that go with our parents and our grandparents' generation, we mustn't lose those. To Trevor, I just only had the opportunity to ask him this morning how, in fact, I'd spoken to Trevor on the phone and email, but I didn't really sit down and say, listen, how did all this start? And of course it came from Irene getting out all her father's, Frank's memorabilia, and Trevor going through it. And here were these magnificent handwritten manuscript. And it was clear that once Trevor had read it, that there was so much information here that one simply couldn't leave it sitting on a shelf somewhere. And then ultimately it came to Phil, and he said to me, what should we do with it? Well, I suppose if you gave it to the War Memorial, it'd sit on some shelf somewhere and get dusty, but it merited more than that. The fact that Frank had sat down during the 1980s and spent years handwriting his memoirs. I mean, it's easy enough today when you've got computers and so on and so forth, but to sit down and write out one's memoirs in longhand, it just warranted something more than it sitting on a shelf somewhere. So that's how the whole thing came about. I should just finish here and say the book's launched, but I'm sorry, I've come all this way, so I'm going to give you another 5 or 10 minutes. It would be remiss of me if I just didn't pass on a few of my comments, at least, looking back on this history that forms so much of our culture and our nation's sense of nationhood and identity because of what happened there. And do we focus too much on Kokoda? I'm not sure, but to put things in context, in 1942, that was the real turning point. We were 6 months, 7 months into the war, and the Australians who lived here genuinely thought that they were going to be invaded by the Japanese. And it was these men who were up on the Kokoda track who were there at the turning point after Kokoda and after Guadalcanal and after Milne Bay towards the end of 1942. As the Japanese suffered their first defeat, it became apparent that maybe that wasn't going to happen, that maybe Australia would ultimately win the war as more Americans came. So it was a real focal turning point in Australia's history. If you debunk all the myths that supposedly have been written about Kokoda, in fact what the Australians achieved there was even more significant than we had originally thought about, such as that the Japanese had very little intelligence about the track. Not so, they had a great deal of intelligence, both naval and army intelligence. They had the overland route was the preferred route as opposed to the seaward route, even given the difficulties. They had better medical care and managed disease more than we had thought. The Allied Air Force didn't interdict their supply chains to the degree that we had previously thought. Very few historians acknowledged that the amount of artillery that the Japanese had with them. Even at the turning point at Iori Biwa, the furthest point of advance, they had 12 heavy machine guns and 9 artillery pieces firing at line of sight towards the Australians. So the Japanese had many force multipliers on their side that makes the achievements of the Australians much more significant. I'll just finish on one more, without going into the whole strategic issues. Reading Frank's book gives you a much more vivid view of how the Australian soldier saw Australia's achievement on the track. You're actually there, you're on the battlefield. I'll finish by just saying that we have to remember I think it might have been Irene, you said this morning, more than just the First World War, the Second World War, and all the battles that Australia has been involved in. These men were up against professional, hardened soldiers. These Japanese, there had been 1 million Japanese fighting in China from early 1930. They were hardened, they had the code of Bushido, they expected to die for their country. There were no prisoners taken on the Kokoda track, not one Australian who fell prisoner to the Japanese survived. They were just butchered. The Australians had come, they'd been brought up with a totally different culture. They were citizen soldiers. They were men like Frank, who was a devoted husband, who had 2 little daughters, and yet he gave up his life for 5 or 6 years, as it was, to go overseas and fight. It was his intention that he should come home. As George, the American General Patton, George S. Patton said, the object of war is not to die for your country, it's to make the other bastard die for his. So these guys did want to come home, and they fought a vicious enemy. 40,000 died out of a population of 7 million. If you translate that to today's terms, in other words, what's that number represent in actual proportion of our society? It'd be the equivalent of 120,000 men dying today, and good Lord, the nation mourns at the loss of one soldier in Afghanistan, as it should do. It brings out all our dignitaries to attend their funeral and so on and so forth. But imagine if today we lost 120,000, and it brings home to you not just the sacrifices of the men and in many cases women, if they were part of the Army or Air Force Corps, Naval Corps, but the sacrifices of the families that were left behind. One can imagine the mothers and sisters and daughters at home waiting for the knock on the door. And I've had a son in Afghanistan for 4 months. He said to me when he left, Dad, if you hear of an Australian soldier being killed in Afghanistan, don't worry, it's not me, because they come and knock on your door and tell you beforehand. So you can imagine for 4 months I just hid under the bed. I didn't want to knock. But imagine if your family, with that level of casualties, and you were at home for 5 or 6 years with your loved ones away, the trauma and drama it must have brought to the many families who were here. And in reading Frank's, on finishing I'll say, in reading Frank's memoirs, this sense of honour and duty and all the values that he encompassed comes through. And to have someone like that in your family, you should be extremely proud of it. I hope the book means a great deal to you personally, because you've inherited those values almost unconsciously. It's part of your family upbringing. And it's a massively wonderful contribution, Frank contribution, to have a first-hand account of the Second World War, and I hope that it proves to be a really valuable contribution to Australia's history. So on that note, I say that the Frank Sublet's memoirs are officially launched.